Hello and welcome to the Building Podcast. Today's episode focuses on one of the huge opportunities for both our construction sector and for our society as a whole. Our housing is some of the worst in Europe, with poorly functioning homes leaking energy. Couple this with the drive for net zero by 2050, and this creates a huge opportunity for all of us within our sector. We're really lucky to have Rico Wojtulewicz to talk through the reasons for retrofit and some of the blockers that have hitherto prevented the wholesale projects from taking off. Rico, welcome to the Building Podcast.
Very much, Mr. Wakeford.
Super. Rico, I'm fascinated by this topic of retrofit. We've got between 26 and 29 million homes. It presents a huge opportunity for our sector and also a huge challenge on so many different fronts. So I'm looking forward to sort of dissecting these and getting a bit of a better understanding about what we're all about. But let's start, as we always do, by a bit about you and just tell us, what your role is at the National Federation of Builders and why you happen to know so much about this particular topic.
So I'm head of policy and market insight at the National Federation of Builders. I spend a lot of time looking after the House Builders Association. And the reason I do that is because actually a lot of construction comes through house building. You get your civil works and you get the workers filtering down with transferable skills to other sectors. So it's a really interesting place to position yourself. But obviously I look after the contracting members and the heritage members. And my role is to kind of lobby for their needs. I do all the media work for the NFB. I kind of craft the policy strategies, and aside from that, I guess what I do is I regurgitate members' viewpoints, and then I try and put that into some sort of strategy and potential for either the industry or the government. And I spend a lot of time working with government, trying to get them to actually understand what it is that industry does. Because if I'm honest, politicians are less inclined to speak to builders, and they can just about cope with somebody regurgitating stuff that builders say.
Yeah, well, we know they like having their picture taken in a nice, shiny, fluorescent yellow jacket on this construction site, but I accept trying to communicate and explain some of these actually really quite intricate concepts is quite a challenge for politicians to understand in sound bites. And so I think it's great that you're synthesizing what the members are saying and passing that back up to government in something that they might be able to understand. But let's start with a definition of retrofit, because retrofit, and I know you've experienced, I've certainly experienced it, can mean very different things to different people. And yet it's quite a broad spectrum of work that comes under the topic. Should I just give a sort of definition of retrofit and where it fits into, or why it's so important?
I think historically, maybe the last 10, 15 years, government has looked at it as ensuring a building is more energy efficient. Now, when you use the word retrofit with our heritage members, they get quite annoyed. They call it renovation. And I think that historically that's typically how we viewed it. You renovate a building and you improve it, or you change its function. But I think that increasingly retrofit in terms of kind of improving your fabric, your insulation, has changed a little bit. And actually, I think the energy side now is becoming increasingly important. And even on the grid side, what does that mean in terms of retrofitting? I was in a meeting yesterday where the DNO's distribution network operator were using the word retrofit in terms of delivering high levels of energy on an existing site. So what does retrofit mean? It just means putting in stuff that's already, putting in new stuff in a place that already exists, or a thing that already exists.
Right. So that covers everything. And I suppose, in terms of housing in particular, it's not just the energy front we've got to look at, but it's also the quality of homes and the quality of living. I mean, we get quite a lot of press at the moment about poor quality ventilation, about mold growth particularly in council houses. That all can be renovated, as you say, or repaired with a proper retrofit program.
And it's really good that you brought up ventilation, because it's very often ignored, because we are seeking to make our homes warmer when people look at a retrofitting strategy. So they stick in all the insulation, fantastic. They close up all the air leakage. Actually, air leakage isn't often discussed or thought about. People think of drafts, well, actually there's a lot more air leakage. And I know it myself because I retrofitted my building. And we've seen an increase in mould on the walls, and now I'm looking at, do I need an MVHR system? Maybe I've done a little bit too much work. And actually, that's going to be a really important factor, because there is this. So you started the podcast saying we've got the leakiest homes in Europe. Actually, the data for that is very poor, and it was done by TADO. And it's not criticism; it's just unless you get into the real detailed policy side, you look at how the methodology of the project. It was done by TADO, and they looked at how what are the costs, what are the ingredients to heating a home, and they covered that across Europe. What they didn't tell you is that perhaps in places like Sweden, they would have log burners, and so what they did is they measured the temperature differences between certain periods of the day. Now, if you've got a log burner that continues running after your main heating system goes off, well, of course, that's going to distort the way we view that outcome. But it isn't wrong to say that we have some of the oldest buildings in the UK, in Europe, and that then means that you will have different complications. Ironically, as I found recently, when you're using a heat pump as an example, some of the really old buildings, some of the stone buildings, yes, they might leak a bit of energy, but they're actually fairly airtight. So they're actually quite good candidates. And this is the biggest problem we've got. 12.5 million homes built to potentially traditional methods. 8 million homes without cavity walls. 16.5 million homes before we had building regulations nationally. So we're going to have a lot of expertise and innovation to retrofit our buildings to the standard government wants, and then the standard that really, if we're going to hit our climate targets, that deep retrofit element that we are going to aspire to be delivering. And that's good, because it means you have better health, better buildings, less energy used, and that's all positive. But getting there is hard work, and if we don't recognise that complexity, we're going to keep making mistakes, as we saw with cavity wall insulation and spray foam very, very recently.
Yeah. I mean, it's lots of things to unpack there, Rico, but let's just start with that complexity, because that complexity is something which I believe has been perhaps the biggest drag for trying to get on with this, because you've got the law of unintended consequences that you've described very, very eloquently there about mold growing. You put lots of ventilation on, and suddenly you start getting mold growing everywhere. How do we actually overcome this complexity? Do we need some standards that we're working to, or do we have a expertise that we have? What's the best way of tackling this problem?
If you go through a government programme, you will use somebody that's past 2035 qualified, accredited, and they will typically be a retrofit coordinator, and they will have a whole house approach. They will be able to understand what is occurring within that building, what the construction methods are, what needs to be considered. So if you've got a suspended timber floor, then there's a good chance that you've got a lot of air exchange coming from that. So if you tighten that up, what's the secondary element you need to consider? Well, that's the position I put myself in. Lovely warm floors now, but where was the ventilation coming from? Well, it was the floors. But even within that, the retrofit coordinator needs to kind of look at that and go, well, are your bricks, ventilation bricks, in the right places? Is there good cross ventilation? Actually, in a lot of homes there aren't, particularly if you are adding maybe a conservatory later down the line, where you might have a concrete slab next to a timber frame, suspended timber floor. So you need somebody to understand that. And on the government side, when you're in government works, that is available. For the rest of us, I don't think the majority of people that are going to go on these retrofitting journeys are going to have a retrofit coordinator. So I think what we need is digital building passport. And that kind of plans the consumer's journey to retrofitting, knowing that if you've got X, you need Y, you need to consider Z. But unless you know what your building has, and it's identified in a logbook almost, then you're less able to understand that. You're less able to inform the contractor. Or if you do get somebody to do all those works, the contractor may be their own retrofit coordinator. They're less able. So we just need something to get consumers excited about this, because as you said, 26 to 28 million homes, that is a lot of work and a lot of complexity, and we do not build all homes the same. They are a mismatch of all different types of styles and designs and construction methods, and that is hard to understand. And actually, I think the consumer is a good person to understand that, because no one likes to waste money.
No, absolutely.
Apart from government, by the way.
No. Well, I'm not going to go there on this podcast, Rico, because we haven't got time. But just talk about this passport a bit more. So how would the passport actually function for a house, for a home?
So there is somebody out there, there's a group already putting this thing together. Unfortunately, in my view, it's very complicated. So it goes into a lot of the real kind of detail, and it's quite data driven. And perhaps only if you're a contractor, you're going to understand it. What we need is we need a bit more of a kind of a visual. These people did these works on your home. You say insulated your walls. Brilliant. Okay. Well, what does that mean now? Well, you might have like a tree. Consider this and consider that, so that the consumer can just follow a very simple journey. Underneath that, you would have your more complex outcomes and thought processes. But the reason I say that particularly is because some of the country now understands what an EPC is. Sorry, I'm going to rephrase that. Some of the country now understands that they have an EPC. Most people don't know that the EPC doesn't actually measure the energy efficiency of your building. It measures the cost to run that building. So, but look, it's good that people understand what an EPC is. If you have a digital passport, whatever it might be, digital buildings passport, and you make it complicated, you're just adding an extra layer. So you need something very basic and simple. And I'm a little bit worried because we're looking at changing EPCs, that there's going to be too many measures added to the new EPC and we're going to put people off again. At the end of the day, we need to understand that unless government is going to spend £3 trillion to deep retrofit all of our buildings, this is going to be a consumer-led strategy, and consumers will deliver cost savings, more workers to actually reduce the cost of those works, but also deliver better outcomes. But more importantly, innovation. And you look at something like Portland cement mortar and lime mortar, those elements, what's used and why? Well, lime mortar is probably better in all buildings, but it's vital in many buildings. So just to ensure that you've got enough workers and innovation on that side, that we can actually have enough lime mortar and it's cheaper and better quality, that is so important. But unless you enable the consumer, sometimes through policy, but sometimes through guidance, you are not going to deliver the right retrofit strategy. And we need to just keep thinking about that, because it's not just about warmer homes, it's about healthy buildings.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite a challenge, isn't it? Because we talked about the complexity of retrofit and the law of unintended consequences. And I know that if you're going to make a decision between an OPC and a lime mortar, it's actually quite an involved decision. And many people still get that wrong. Many people put an ordinary Portland cement mortar up when they should be putting a lime mortar up. And these people are supposed experts in the industry or experienced people. So I think that passport is going to necessarily be quite a complicated beast that people are going to need to understand. So there's going to need to be a lot of support for homeowners if we're going to be rolling that sort of program out, to be able to take them through that retrofit program. Do you think there's just moving on a little bit, and are there some reasonable measures on how to retrofit? So are there benchmarks or how do you measure the performance of a retrofit? So if I'm a contractor selling a retrofit, how's my customer going to know I've done a good job?
That's a great question. So you could go, there's an international standard called NFB, which comes from the passive house model. Passive house is a new build property building method, really airtight, uses tiny bits of energy. Every surface is going to be 17 degrees Celsius at all times. The NFB model, which is really deep retrofit, that has to be accredited and tested. So if you go that route, you are guaranteed a good outcome, but you're looking at £80,000 to £120,000 per home, and that's probably more of a standard home. Most people are not going to do that unless they are doing a considerable renovation. So you could do a blower test or a pulse test to see the air leakage, air exchange in the buildings. In the winter time, you can use thermal digital cameras, thermal imaging, to understand where the cold spots are. That will at least help you identify whether the workers either needs to be done or has been done to a decent standard. And there are little things you can kind of look at, just kind of in the regulations, the amount of loft insulation you might have. But again, it's down to just loft insulation is a great example. Are the eaves covered? Is there ventilation? Have you got a cold roof or a warm roof? Now, this stuff isn't necessarily complicated, but it's complex enough for not everyone to understand it, even, unfortunately, the people doing the works in some instances. So there is guidance that you can look at for very basic works. And I think that, single glazing, double glazing, that kind of change, Are all the gaps around the windows filled? Very basic things that we need to understand that perhaps don't get into the real complexities. So just those little things can make a massive difference. Draft exclusion. So there are things that the individual consumer can do, but there isn't, I don't think, a one-stop shop of a guidance document that tells you exactly what you should be looking at. And maybe we should be doing that. On the NFB website, we've got something for heritage buildings, so that if members are a bit unsure, they can look at the very many guides that we've got to really identify what the works they should be doing, and most importantly, how they should be doing it.
Okay, yeah. So some scope there on how we do it. Just, I mean, the one thing which is another common theme on these podcasts is the skills we need to do this. And you're talking there about a retrofit where a great number of skills are going to be needed, cross skills. So you can't just have a plumber or an electrician, which is a traditional apprenticeship route. You're talking about a multi-skilled operatives to be able to do this work. How can the industry respond to provide that level of competence or confidence to our customers?
One reason I like the digital building passport is because effectively industry will tell on industry. Look, quality is important. We need to think about that. But if you know who's done the works, and if someone else comes and does some other works and then goes, you know what, that was terrible, at least you can then identify what company didn't do the good job, and you can identify what companies either need upskilling or removing from the sector. I worry that this licensing strategy that some put forward actually don't deliver the right outcomes. They just add more bureaucracy. We look at some of the schemes, Trustmark, MCS. I think they're great, but they don't necessarily ensure quality. Not always, and that's a slight problem. I kind of favour more of a independent dispute resolution alongside insurance, so that the consumer's always supported, and you can always make sure that work is done to a better standard if it does go wrong. But you need that almost tell on industry approach, which is like the digital building passport. But in terms of that insurance, it is quite difficult. And so if you want a skilled workforce to deliver all this, you're going to need the consumer to lead it. And the reason I say that is because as a company, you can't just stick your hand in the pocket and hope that there's going to be work available. No. The last government accidentally did a great thing, and that was they said, we support air source heat pumps. Now, what they didn't understand is when they said that and they implemented it within a few policies, the industry suddenly geared up because they knew there was a pipeline of work and certainty, and they're having most of the barriers removed, which was consumers not being so sure about it. Now they're getting more and more installers, so we can actually start to ramp up. We're nowhere near enough to deal with demand, but that's good because it means that if you invest in an air source heat pump installer or designer in your company, there will be work available. For the rest of industry, there isn't that consumer confidence and even knowledge, and that's what the government should be focusing on. You can train 1 million people to do 1 million jobs, but if the jobs aren't there, what is the point? And that's the stage we're at with retrofit. And there are some elements, not just consumer based, but planning based, that also create those barriers.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's installing an air source heat pump is requires both plumbing and electrical skills, and it's a relatively isolated product. The law of unintended consequences. If you've done your heating calculations and you know that you're going to be able to put the heat into some radiators that are actually going to heat and work, you've then got the operator, the user, the building owner is going to have to get used to how that heating system works. The lower temperature flow water will impact on how that building is used to some extent. But some of the other challenges around ventilation and mold removal and things like that really require quite a broad breadth of training and experience to be able to do that effectively and to the right standard. And I can see that if you're then going to ensure the results of that individual, you're going to have to be very explicit about what you're doing and what the consequences are, so that there's no confusion, and you're setting those expectations very carefully with your customers. Is that something you think the industry's up for?
I think they are, but are consumers willing to pay for it? That's always the question. And actually, using the heat pump example is an interesting one, because if you are having somebody design it, actually you need to do a heat loss survey, and that heat loss survey hasn't always been done or hasn't been done well, and therefore you're not sizing the heat pump to the right level. Then you might be sticking in a buffer tank, and it's a bit technical now, but is that the right thing to do? Does every room have a different temperature? Well, heat pumps typically like to have one temperature running through the whole building. So the extra knowledge is really important. But I do think industry, if they know there's pipelines of work, will upskill and ensure that they are specialists and they have enough specialists to do these jobs well and sell it to the consumer. But again, is the consumer willing to pay? That's the question.
Well, okay, well, here's a different question then, Rico. I mean, does the NFB have a view on some of the carrots and sticks that we ought to be offering, or government ought to be offering or implementing to encourage this to happen? Because we have a statutory requirement for net zero by 2050. Here we are, 25 years away, with 28 million. It's 1 million homes a year, at least. How should government or how should industry be persuading people to do that?
I favour sticks at the end when the carrots don't work.
Yep.
Because I think that sticks create real difficulties. So we're having an EPC reform because the government knows that the stick is all homes will need to be, rental homes will have to be EPC-C by 2030. Well, they know that's not achievable because they've not put any carrots in. They've not unlocked some of the barriers. They've not enabled innovation in the industry, and therefore they've not made it cost effective. So what are they doing now? They're reforming how the EPC is going to be calculated so that those homes can be delivered. That to me is neither stick nor carrot. It's just flawed.
Now, smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, it's like, look, the EPC needs to be reformed anyway, and I think it's sensible in that way. But as I said earlier, I like the EPC because people kind of understand it. So maybe you need a new metric that they could have utilised. Then you keep the EPC and have a second one alongside it. Maybe as part of a digital buildings passport or something. But we're not going down that route. Fine. So that's a stick.
Yep.
In terms of carrots, so actually I'll go for another stick. So for a long time, government has floated the idea, or civil servants have floated the idea that any renovation work you do on a building, you must upgrade your thermal envelope of the existing building as well. I think they keep getting pushed back because they realise they'll just stop a lot of renovation work because it'll just make things really expensive. So what are we thinking about a carrot? Well, we've got a housing crisis. So if you've got a housing crisis, what do you need to do? You need to create bigger spaces, better homes, because the housing crisis isn't just the number of homes, it's the type of homes we have.
Yep.
So families need more family housing. So let's say instead of doing a loft conversion, you're more able to remove your roof and change your roof. Brilliant. Okay, but you're talking about space, and really people think about renovation. You're going to do your kitchen and you have a heat pump. Well, usually the kitchen. So if you're going to change your roof, can you also have a balcony, a bit of outside space? Well, if the local authority says no, you're not having balconies, well, that's a barrier in itself. But if you say yes, you can have that. You can have a better space. You can have solar panels on top more easily. You can use a mansard roof, which gives you more space internally. You then get to see the interior leaf of your building, your cavities, to see if there are any issues. You can improve the thermal performance of your building at the fabric level in some cases, and you can identify some of the challenges you may have. You instantly create a carrot for the consumer and the industry to have a better building and better skilled workers that can be part of this strategy. That to me is a regulatory carrot. External wall insulation is another one. If you're going to install external wall insulation, why local authorities saying, oh no, you can't have it on the frontage, on the highway facing areas? Because then you're compromising the whole EWI. You can't just say you've got 4 walls just on 3. Well, you're asking for damp issues, particularly where we've got very strong driven rain in the southeast and kind of the coastal regions. So what's a carrot? For me, a carrot is something that when somebody goes to a builder, because they don't go to building control, they don't go to experts, they go to a local builder and they go, can I have this work? The builder goes, you can have this or this or this, and there are no barriers. If the barriers are to the best works and they give you the best outcomes, people are always going to choose the path of least resistance. Again, consumer-led. And this even works for local authorities. So Nottingham Council got Energy Sprong to come and design a load of their buildings, to retrofit a load of the buildings. So sticking a T-cozy on the outside, solar panels, great scheme. Well, it was a great scheme until they realised that they didn't like the aesthetics of the council. So they said, oh, can you redesign them? Okay, we redesign them. We don't like that, can you do another one? So Energy Sprong did a pattern book so they could choose the ones they had. But of course, they only did, I think they were going for 1965 and 1970 buildings and newer, because the older stuff was just getting so complicated in terms of discussions that they just went the other way. So even the council that procured somebody to retrofit their buildings,
Still got stuck.
aim across planning barriers that they implemented. So we've said for a long time we need. So I helped write the national retrofit strategy. I did the policy side. We need a national retrofitting policy framework with a trial across local authorities, so that we won't stop these works. We encourage them to occur, and we encourage innovation and innovators. Another example, wooden windows, pattern book for wooden windows. Don't say no to a wooden window. Don't spend 12 months getting planning for a wooden window. This is an acceptable window. That will encourage industry to start making those windows. Done. We're starting to, inspire consumers and manufacturers and installers. But if we have this barrier approach throughout the whole process, it's going to be one hell of a job, and we'll never do 100,000 homes, let alone 1 million a year.
Yeah. Real challenge. I mean, I do worry about meeting our clients' expectations. I mean, I understand your perspective that it needs to be customer driven, but if we go back to Grenfell Tower, where the customer thought they were getting a competent, fully designed, properly installed building, and they didn't. And let's face it, the installation and the cladding actually should have been relatively straightforward compared to some of the retrofit conundrums that we're going to be presenting homeowners. Do you think there's a potential for a sort of a Grenfell style not meeting of expectation and some of the real disasters that not deaths obviously, but with some major failures in delivery that could be rolled out nationally? Because once you do one house wrong and then you do another 100,000 or another 500,000, it's a major catastrophe in terms of going back to repair that and sort it out.
We had one pre-Grenfell, cavity wall insulation that was blown into buildings. I note that many of the cavity wall installers now are cavity wall removers, cavity wall insulation removers, charging more to take it out than they put it in. I mean, people knew that was happening and saw it coming, but government didn't listen, and they're doing that at scale again.
Right.
And we've got a new one now. Obviously, I don't always make myself very popular in government meetings because I like to speak the truth. And one of those truths was, don't foam spray buildings. You're going to create a nightmare. Well, lo and behold, now all the mortgage companies are saying, remove that, or we're not going to give you a mortgage on a property, which is creating a nightmare in the for people who are selling homes. Probate and stuff like that. It's just a disaster. I can see there's real problems. We're already seeing heat pump mismanagement, mis-selling conversations coming forward. And remember, that is retrofit. Particularly, back to the carrot and the stick. There will be a stick that will remove all gas boilers from buildings at some point.
Yep.
Now, good gosh, well, how's that going to operate? How's that going to work? Now, again, this is back to, does the government understand the industry? So we've got around 60,000 F-gas installers. They can install air-to-air, air source heat pumps, like you might have in a factory or an office block, blown in air. We're used to kind of radiators, which is kind of a hydronic air to water system. So the government only backs air to water. They don't understand that air to air even exists. Even if they cite, oh my God, isn't Sweden amazing? They install all these air source heat pumps. Well, 85% of them are air to air. But we haven't supported air to air, even in the clean heat market mechanism, which forces boiler companies to produce air source heat pumps or sell them. Air-to-air isn't included. So we don't even understand the technology we've got and what we can retrofit it and why we should retrofit it. And this is going to keep coming down the line. And the reason I talk about consumers particularly is because, if we're honest, the majority of people that need to have their building retrofitted aren't going to be extremely wealthy. So they're going to need the best bang for the buck, and they're going to need some of the barriers taken out of place. We don't even know how many people are on looped supply. So that's electricity that is loops between two homes, and so you are limited by the amount of amps you can have in that home. Well, that person may get an electric car because also there's the stick, you have to have electric cars. Well, now they can't charge it at home, or they can and they can't have an air source heat pump. And remember, they're going to have induction heating as well. So where is the end point? Where is the strategy? That's why I think consumers are so important, because if you remove those barriers and those costs, even three-phase electricity, some DNOs are now requiring it. That can cost up to £10,000 per home, and I've seen those quotes.
Yeah.
So it's why I like to focus on consumers, because government is not going to stick their hand in the pocket for trillions of pounds. So we've got to somehow reduce the cost, so maybe they'll stick their hand in their pocket for 500 billion. But
That's
that's
still
the
a big
strategic.
ask, isn't it? But it is,
It is, but you know what? They're sticking their hand in the pocket for more and more and more, and they're having tax breaks and things like that. But again, it has to be. You have to make sure that there's the pipeline of work so that we have the workers, the innovators to actually deliver it, because they're key to this, not any government policy and not technically consumers, because the work will have to be done.
yeah, yeah. So Rico, talk to me about why the work will have to be done, because we've talked around about net zero, we've talked around about quality of homes, we've talked about moving gas boilers, but effectively we've got a dash for electricity, haven't we? So the whole world's moving to an electrical power source, but we're also decarbonising the grid. So presumably, once we've got an electrical power source going into those houses, we don't actually need to reduce the heat demand of those houses if it's an all green network. So because the net zero will be achieved through the power coming into the house rather than the loss of reducing the amount of energy that the houses consume. So what are the drivers that are going to help that happen then?
It's a really good point, and it's a systems thinking approach, because actually there's discussion about fabric fifth. Now, I'm not a really big fan of fabric fifth because it creates a hierarchy of what you should or shouldn't be doing in your building, and it basically says that let's make electricity cheap so you can just keep heating your building without an issue. Okay, I kind of understand that, but it's not really going to necessarily create healthy buildings.
Nope.
It's going to create a lot of extra complexities, loads more technology. Let's just build buildings properly and then use minimum amount of heat. But the one thing about that, if we do electrify, electricity becomes cheap. By the way, historically, energy prices hasn't come down on electricity, even if you remove the levies. But it's by the by. You dry the building out, which is really, really important. You reduce the amount of potential moisture in the air that can be the differential between your cold and your warm air, which reduces the amount of condensation, which reduces mold. So actually, electrification is really good in many aspects, because the way an air source heat pump or typically a low temperature system operates, it's on almost all the time. So your building is at a really good temperature. Okay, you have to change kind of the way you live and how you experience that living. You can't just have lovely burning hot heat, which you're kind of used to with gas. But I've got underfloor heating. It's really nice. So that's a real positive. And actually, I like to think of it as a systems thinking, because what does that deliver? Well, if more people start to electrify, more electric batteries in our vehicles. Battery technology is changing incredibly. I won't get onto that, even though I'm a bit obsessed with it. More people installing solar panels, the efficiency of them is improving. Even solar thermal, I've got solar thermal, amazing between March and October. Amazing. Okay, you don't have a lot of heat from that, but you don't have a lot of energy use from that. But once you start moving everything to electrification, you actually start to decentralize things. That's good, because you could have independent networks, distribution networks, and it means that we start moving to a system whereby actually energy may actually end up being cheaper. And you're producing wind energy at night. Well, it can be stored in a building now, in homes. So the retrofitting side is so important, because it will start to unlock these things that we have to do anyway. Not if you're meeting climate ambitions. I actually try to remove the climate targets from everything I discuss, because I used to say this quite a lot. Do you want a faster car that's got better acceleration? Oh, yeah, I love that. Everyone's saying, fantastic, brilliant, yeah. All right, we'll get yourself an electric car, instant power. Okay, yeah, but your range isn't good. Completely agree. Well, we're getting to the point now where range is damn brilliant. And that's because the innovation, the consumer went, I like this. I'm going to keep buying more of this. There are those favourable benefits. I worry that the obsession with climate means that we don't think about the innovation. We're seeing even the mad stuff now with politicians that say, let's stick pylon cables underground. Oh, no, not pylons, really, but and by the way, I've been told by an engineer in London I must call them towers and never pylons. But we are starting to now roll back on the progress we've made, and retrofit will actually deliver us better technological outcomes and better living outcomes. And we need to think of it in those terms and it's good for the NHS, whatever, all that separate stuff. But if we start to think of it, of the benefits technologically and for society, and where we might be in 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 years, where electrification will be so important, that's the approach we should be taking, and not simply about the climate, because if we miss our targets, we'll just have a massive fine, but it won't make society any better. And that's the thing that we need to really be considering.
Yeah. No, then definitely wise words there. I think that the challenge for us all then is educating those customers, isn't it? That's really what we're coming back to, is how do we educate our customers, our homeowners, that this is what's A, necessary, and B, the value that that's going to provide them as occupiers of homes. And that's, I think, is that going to be down to the industry, or has that government got a role to play in that?
I think, well, look, even if you have all the information in the world on a government website, they're still going to ask the builder. So
yeah,
we still need to make sure that the builders are educated, or they can find out the right information, and they want to. That's the key factor. They want to. When I did my building, when I did all my floors, and I did a lot of work on my property, I actually rang up 3 companies from a competitors' trade association because I couldn't afford mine, and I told them what I needed doing, and they didn't have a clue, despite saying that they were experts in this, which really drove me mad. So I did, I've actually got a bit of a history in renovating buildings. My parents are nutters, and I lived in 17 houses before I was 18. So, kind of, it was always a bit in my blood. And that's why I'm a bit obsessed with all this as well, because we kind of completely disregard the construction sector and the trades, despite them having some of the most amazing skills ever. So that retrofitting element is important, but educating the consumer is important, but giving them making sure the industry understands what it is that can be done and why is probably more important. But I think we should still empower consumers to challenge industry, because that will actually deliver better outcomes. And look, it's easy for me. I represent the National Federation of Builders. I ask members a question, they know the answer because they live and die by reputation. It's not the case for everybody, so we need to ensure that we can kind of close that gap. But again, it's about teaching politicians as well. So we're talking about energy early, electricity, and all this, and I was talking about loop supply as well. I see in Scotland now some local authorities are requiring 20 kilowatt chargers, not 7.5 kilowatt. Now, Germany, they've got 50, 150, 250 installed kilowatt chargers. Nobody should think, and this is what politicians need to think about, that we're going to go backwards. We are going to be wanting more, which means the consumer is going to be wanting more. And unless we start thinking in those terms, especially on the grid, we're not even going to be able to deliver enough for the consumer. If you're having an induction hob, you're going to need a different fuse system. You're going to need your own, its own cabling system. I think it's 6 millimeter cable just to that one element. Use your own fuse, 32 amp fuse. So there's a lot of complexity here that needs to really be understood, particularly if you do have some sticks. And that's where the government needs to also understand it and work with industry to understand that those sticks might end up creating new barriers.
Yeah. And I think that, that calls actually that sophistication we're going to see in building management systems, controlling where that power goes and what it's used for at any one time. I think it's a really exciting time to be in the sector. The opportunities and the sophistication, the complexity are just fantastic, but all that's there to provide that a really good result for customers and consumers, as we talk about. Rico, I'm aware of time, and we've had a good run through all sorts of areas on retrofit. I'm going to ask your last question. If you've got sort of a magic wand and you're sprinkling your fairy dust around, what would be the sort of 2 or 3 things that you might like either politicians or contractors or designers or even your consumers to start doing? Where do you think the easy big wins are for today?
Good way to phrase that question, because I had one that was magic wand, do whatever I want. Give me 3 trillion for deep retrofit of energy sprung and anything.
Yeah, okay, well, that's not going to happen.
But if we're going to be deliverable, if I'm in Desnes tomorrow, or I'm at CLG, and they say, Rico, solve this for us, immediately I'm having the National Retrofitting Policy Framework. It's deliverable tomorrow. I'm having the Digital Buildings Passport, without question, straight away. I am removing the planning barriers to enable more outcomes, so that we enable both consumers and the industry to know what they can do and why they can do it. And I am appreciating the complexity. and I'm not going, this will solve this. I'm really thinking about it. And as part of that, I'm thinking people like lovely buildings. People want a good space before they want to save carbon or even energy. Okay, so that's the context that I would start. I would still think about how we know why and how we would deliver more, but I would think about what are people's push points, whether that is your contractor. I was on the Green Homes grant. I warned the government about everything that was happening because it was very obvious that it was going to fail and not enough industry was going to get part of it. We burnt again, like we did with the green loan, was it in the 2010s?
So the green bank was
we did the same thing again. We burnt industry that spent loads of money upskilling their workforce to then find there was no work. So you've got to understand what both the consumer and the industry needs, wants, and can deliver, and have a strategy. And I think, that's why I brought up the National Retrofitting Policy Framework and the Digital Buildings Passport, because they start to bring people into a sphere where we understand and we want to deliver. They're the two things I would literally do tomorrow, and I don't understand why we're not pushing for them, because they're very simple, they'll be very effective. Perhaps it's because they don't make politicians the saviours. But maybe I'm a cynic. Maybe I've been doing the shopping.
I'm not even going to rise to that one, Rico. I think that's, I think government's responsibility is creating the right environment for industry to go and flourish, and industry only flourishes when it meets consumers' requirements. So I think, and the retrofit market I think you've described would exactly fit that paradigm. That would work very well. Rico, thank you very much indeed for your time today. We've had a good expose of some of the challenges we've got there and some of the opportunities. I think with 26 to 28 million homes to retrofit for 2050, there's a huge opportunity for us all. And it sounds as though you're doing your bit in trying to chivvy government along and to make this into a reality to allow that to happen. So good luck, and I wish you every success in bringing that about. But thank you very much for your time today.
I'll just say one last thing, sorry, Mark, just to be a bit of a pain.
Go on then.
Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund is a really good fund. So if you're in the industry looking at guaranteed workflows, that's a good fund that's going to deliver you good outcomes. So think about that if you're a contractor or a builder.
That's your third item out of two. Then I offered you three, so I'll accept that one.
I never shut up, do I?
Just as well. Rico, thank you very much.